Want to become a Lightroom expert? Well, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to cover every panel in the Develop module of Lightroom Classic. And thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring it. The first thing we have are three options: Auto, Black and White, and HDR. Auto will do its best to analyze your photo and apply adjustments. This may help you get the ball rolling if you have no idea where to start. Clicking B&W will turn your photo black and white. Clicking HDR will enable HDR editing of your photo if you are working with a high dynamic range image and give you additional editing options. Next is the profile option. This lets you select how Lightroom will interpret your colors. We always leave ours at the default Adobe color. Then we have white balance. You can choose from presets. You can manually adjust tint and temperature, or you can use the eyedropper. When using the eyedropper, find something that should appear white and click on it. Just don't click on blown out areas of the photo because it won't work properly. It doesn't matter what method you use, as long as it works for you. Sometimes we'll try out auto and see if we like the adjustments. If not, we'll do it manually until our white balance looks correct. In the tone section, you can adjust the exposure and contrast of your image. The highlights slider can be used to bring detail back into your highlights or blow them out, and the same for the shadows. Bring detail back by lifting them or crush the details into the dark. The whites and black sliders will adjust both the white point and black point of the image, affecting its tonal range. As a rule of thumb, first adjust the highlights and the shadow slider to see if you can achieve the look that you're after before you mess with the whites and blacks. We don't often make large adjustments with these two sliders. Next, we have texture, clarity, and dehaze. These can be used to bring out or hide details, but in different ways. Texture is great for bringing out detail without screwing with the overall tone of the image. I also lower the texture slider to smooth out skin on portraits. Clarity brings out detail in a more gritty way. When overdone, it reminds me of HDR band photos from 2007. Dehaze is great for adding a little punch to images because it adds both contrast and saturation. I use this all the time with skies, but also most of the presets I make have a little touch of dehaze just because it adds a nice finishing touch of punch that I usually want in an image. Vibrance and saturation both affect the color of your image, but vibrance will affect the saturation of more muted colors in your image, whereas saturation just affects all hues equally. Let's start by taking a quick tour around the tone curve panel. At the top is our channel selection. The left puts you in parametric mode, more on that in a minute. Then there's RGB, which will adjust all three channels together. And we can also select each individual channel to edit the tone curve for the reds, greens, and blues respectively. Front and center is obviously the tone curve itself. The horizontal axis represents our input values, basically the tonal range of our image. It starts with the darkest part of our image on the left, getting progressively lighter as we move to the right. The vertical axis represents changes we make to the tonal range, resulting in our output values, or what the image looks like after making adjustments to the tone curve. At its default 45-degree angle, no changes are being made. Since our input values are unchanged, we have the same output values as well. Nothing is happening yet. In its most basic sense, creating a point along the tone curve and dragging up will brighten up the image, and lowering the point will darken the image. By default, we have 2 points set, the black point and the white point. If you wanted to create a faded look, for instance, you can simply drag the black point up. This takes pure black and makes it gray. Similarly, we can pull the white point down to give the image a more muted look. Once again, this takes pure white and makes it a light gray. Something to keep in mind with the tone curve is you generally want to avoid creating sharp and drastic adjustments because it can just result in some wacky tones. Instead, try not to add too many points and keep the adjustments smoother and more gradual. If you do need to delete a point, just right-click on it and choose Delete Control Point. And if you want to start over with the curve completely, you can right-click and choose Reset Channel, or go to this drop-down and select Linear. Below that, we have the relatively new Refine Saturation slider, which lets you dial back the saturation of the tone curve. Then there are three presets: Linear, Medium Contrast, and Strong Contrast, which will add points and make adjustments to the curve automatically. You can also create and save your own preset, which is really helpful. Back up at the top, we can enter into parametric mode, which works in conjunction with the point mode, meaning you can make all the adjustments you want in point mode, and then in parametric mode, you can make further adjustments, and it'll still keep intact all of the point mode adjustments you just made. Parametric mode utilizes sliders to create a tone curve instead of points. In the top left, we have the target adjustment circle, which if we click on it, we can then go over to our image and click and drag up or down to add a point along the curve and move it up or down. Just hovering over different parts of your image will show you where on the tone curve that part of the image lies. Formerly known as the HSL panel, next up it's the color mixer. Let's start by taking a quick overview of the panel itself. At the top, we have Mixer, which is the familiar HSL panel, and a newer addition called Point Color. Let's start with Mixer. You can arrange the sliders by hue, saturation, and luminance, or you can arrange it by color. It just comes down to what you prefer. Let's go with HSL and choose to show all of the options. On the left of each section, we have this target adjustment circle, which works similarly to the one in the tone curve panel. If we click it, we can then go to our image and hover over an area we want to adjust, and then click and drag up to move all corresponding sliders to the right, or down to move all corresponding sliders to the left. For instance, if we want to adjust the luminance on our model's face, you can see that it predominantly adjusts the orange slider, but it's also affecting the red slider as well. These target adjustment circles are super helpful for situations like this and can be used for hue, saturation, or luminance. Let's take a look at the hue section. With everything set to 0, these are the true hues as interpreted by Lightroom. If we look at the opposite ends of each slider, we can see how the hue will be affected by dragging the slider in either direction. For example, if we want to adjust the purple hues in this photo and make them more blue, we can drag the purple slider to the left. Now, if we wanted to make the blue hues more aqua, we can drag the blue slider to the left. This is obviously a dramatic example, but you can see how we went from purple to blue and aqua with just these two sliders. So for red, left will make them more magenta, right will make them more orange. For orange, left will make them more red, right will make them more yellow, and so on and so forth. All right, let's move on down to saturation. This one is pretty self-explanatory, but let's take a look. Here we can see our pink backdrop got a little washed out. If we try turning up the overall saturation for the image, we can see it gets really gross really fast and the pink still looks a bit washed. So let's grab the target adjustment circle and then click and drag up on the backdrop. This really starts to punch things up a bit. You can think of luminance as the intensity of the color. In practical use, dragging a slider to the left will make that color darker, richer, and more intense. Taking the slider to the right will make that color lighter, more washed out, and less intense. A lot of times you may want to lift the luminance a small amount on the face of your subject just to keep the skin tone looking just right. Another common adjustment would be adjusting the luminance of the sky. Point color mode allows you to use the eyedropper to select a specific hue and then shift the hue, saturation, and luminance of that color. You can use the sliders, or you can drag around here to adjust the color. To really narrow down the hue that you are affecting, you can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance range, and check the box to visualize the range to see exactly what you're going to be adjusting. The color grading panel is one of my favorites. You'll get the 3-way view by default, which includes midtones, shadows, and highlights, or you can move into each individual wheel for more precise control with these 3 icons. And then the last icon is the global color wheel, but more on that in a minute. The basic idea of these color wheels is to separate the pixels in the image by brightness and then allow you to apply a color tint to these different pixels. You can tint the shadows blue, the midtones tan, and the highlights yellow, for example. And of course, you don't have to add color to each wheel, you could just add color to the shadows if you wanted. Let's jump into the shadows view. On all the color wheels, moving the control point in the middle of the wheel will adjust the hue and saturation. We can flip open the arrow to show the sliders for both and watch them move as we drag around the circle. Hold Option or Alt on your keyboard when dragging to move slower. Hold Command or Control on your keyboard to lock in saturation and only adjust the hue. To adjust the saturation, click and then move right or left with your mouse. And then of course, the slider will give you the most precise control over these parameters, so you can use them to dial in the look after getting it close on the color wheel. Below hue and saturation, we have luminance. This controls the brightness of these pixels. So to the right, we can see the shadows get lifted, and to the left, we can see them get darker. You can also click and hold on the eye icon to hide the adjustments of that particular wheel to see a little before and after. So those are the sliders that are specific to each tonal range. You can set these individually for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. The next 2 sliders are global controls and determine how these ranges interact with one another. The first one of these is blending. Blending gives you control over how much the 3 tone ranges overlap with each other. And typically you want some amount of overlap so the image has nice smooth transitions between the tonal ranges. To illustrate this, I'm going to turn the image black and white and then add some color to our shadows. When we turn blending down to 0, we can see the color is now restricted to the darkest portions of the image. And when we turn blending up to 100, the shadows overlap more with the midtones, adding color to the jackets and their skin. The default value of 50 is a good starting point, but always keep in mind how you can play with blending to get different looks. Below blending is balance. Remember how these color wheels break color into 3 tonal ranges? Well, changing the balance slider will change how these ranges are defined. When we bring the slider to the left, the brighter pixels will start to become treated like our shadows, getting tinted with lots of color. Dragging the slider to the right makes our darker pixels treated more like brighter ones, which here is no color tint whatsoever. So just to recap, blending determines how the tonal ranges blend together, and balance determines how each tonal range is defined. Global color is a really nice way to add a color cast to your entire image. For instance, adding a little green tint in this image can change the mood and give it an almost film-like quality. The luminance slider will brighten or darken the image as a whole. In the detail panel, we first have sharpening. If your photo is out of focus, sharpening won't fix that. It only creates the illusion of detail and sharpness by adding contrast to edges. The amount is just the amount of sharpening being applied. Radius controls the thickness of the edge where the contrast will be applied. And detail controls the amount of sharpening applied to the details in your photo. So if the detail slider is set to a low amount, you'll only sharpen larger edges, and to sharpen more edges, increase the detail slider. My favorite way to apply sharpening is by applying it to only the most in focus areas. So to do so, turn up the masking slider. You can hold Alt or Option on your keyboard when doing so to see the areas in white that will get sharpened. The lens corrections panel can help you remove distortion and chromatic aberration from your photos. You can check the boxes for both to have it applied automatically. Lightroom has a library of lenses it supports with corrections built in. You can also adjust distortion and vignetting manually. And in the manual tab, you can override the automatic lens corrections or create your own adjustments if Lightroom does not have your specific lens's corrections in its library. The transform panel is incredibly useful. This can really help those shots when walls or buildings feel like they're falling away from you. You can use it to fix perspectives, straighten your shot, and so on. You can start by clicking auto, and Lightroom will do its best to straighten and level out your perspectives. Sometimes it works great, and other times you'll want to do it manually. If you click guided, you can then draw horizontal and vertical lines to tell Lightroom what you want to appear straight. Then Lightroom will transform the perspective. Check constrained crop to have it automatically crop in as needed. Lens blur is a relatively new addition, but similar to how your phone probably has a portrait mode, which can blur the background. Lens blur can work similarly. Check the box to apply it, and Lightroom will do its best to identify the background and blur it. Let's turn up the amount so you can really see it. Let's also boost the bokeh. And now I can click through to test out the different bokeh styles. Here's another example. Apply the blur. By default, Lightroom detects your subject and blurs the background, but you could also switch to manually adjusting the focal point. You can tighten the focal range and have it blur everything else. You can also use a brush to refine things if the auto masking misses some areas. The effects panel consists of vignetting and grain. For a dark vignette, move the amount slider to the left. For a white vignette, gross, slide it to the right. You can further tweak the vignette with the sliders below. Then we have grain. I like adding grain to my photos and it works very simply. Adjust the amount and the size and roughness. There isn't much more to it than that. Also, I'm getting kind of tired. Finally, one of my all-time favorite panels, calibration. People often wonder what the difference is between adjusting the hues here and the hues down in calibration. And the main difference is calibration adjusts the value of every pixel and HSL does not. HSL only adjusts values of set hue ranges per slider. If I adjust the red hue in the color mixer, it's only changing the colored squares that fall into that red hue range. Whereas if I change the red primary hue in calibration, it's going to adjust the RGB value of every pixel, regardless of where it falls in the hue range. Remember, calibration affects everything and HSL is localized to a specific color. I hope that makes sense. So let's start with the top and work our way down. And my advice for editing is always this: Crank a parameter hard in both directions to see exactly what it's doing to your image, and then just dial it back to taste. Think of calibration as developing the color profile of your image. It can help define the palette and the colors included in your image. Once you've defined this, you can then make further adjustments in all the other panels, but I think calibration is actually a pretty good place to start to build your edit. Shadow tint is the simplest calibration parameter. To the left, we add green to the shadows, and to the right, magenta. I tend to like adding a little green to my shadows. You can really do whatever you'd like. Let's take a look at a red primary adjustment. If we wanted the reds in the image to look more pink, which direction would we move the hue slider? Well, to the left. And we can kind of see that on the slider, it indicates a more pinkish hue on the left. Now this one adjustment already created such a dramatic difference in the look of the photo. And then to take it to a more orangish yellow, we can drag it to the right. And of course, it's worth noting how other colors are affected here as well. Even though this image has a more limited color palette, we can see the concrete gets this yellowish tint, along with the bark along the trees. For this image, I want to bring the hue back toward pink a little. For saturation, right now I'm thinking I want to keep the colors punchy and bold, so a little boost in saturation might be nice. Next is green primary. We don't have a lot of green in our image, but as you know, adjusting the sliders here will still have an effect. So let's take a look. I actually like the hue cranked pretty far to the right. We can also see that we have brought in a subtle aqua tone into the sky as well. Bringing saturation lower will tone things down a bit, and adding it in will increase the punchy luminance in the car. The image is starting to have a whimsical feel, and I really like it. The blue section can really make things look pretty crazy. Let's take a look. To the right, we've got purple and greens being introduced into the image. To the left, things tend to look more teal and orange. The sky is an incredibly saturated aqua. The concrete and trees are incredibly warm, I guess. The reds haven't changed too much, just a little brighter and bolder. So with this cranked, let's actually head back up to the red primary and make it an adjustment. With the red hue shifted toward the right, we now have the teal and orange look that was also popular like 7 years ago. But here it's honestly pretty cool. And now that we've made pretty dramatic adjustments to our primary hues, we can start to play around with balance between all three, as well as the saturation. We can also bring back the shadow slider for some more looks as well. I want to show you just how powerful calibration can be with one other example. This photo is a wash with red light by design, but let's say you shot a wedding and you don't really want all of your photos to have the terrible color cast. Well, let's make some adjustments. First, I'll pull the shadows to green, then the red primary toward orange, then the blue primary towards indigo, and then play with the saturation. Now this photo looks entirely different with just a few sliders. Pretty cool. You know what else is pretty cool? The sponsor of this video, Squarespace. Now that you're a Lightroom master, you may want to showcase your work with your own dedicated Squarespace website. Using the new Design Intelligence feature on Squarespace makes the process of starting from scratch super fast and simple. You don't know where to start with filling out the content of your site? Quit panicking. Design Intelligence gives you a huge head start. You can then try out different color themes and fonts and instantly see how your site will look. Or you can get started with a wide variety of professionally designed website templates, and then make it your own. And when you're ready to book clients, you can easily create professional proposals, estimates, and contracts to make it all official. You can then invoice your clients and accept payments from ACH, direct debit, Klarna, Apple Pay, and more. Head to squarespace.com/mangostreet for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use the code MangoStreet at checkout to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, that was a long one, but I hope you feel more confident when it comes to editing in Lightroom. Thanks so much for watching all the way until the end. We'll see you in the next one.